The dropship shook itself apart on the way down, and Commander Alba Reyes held the grab rail above her head and did not let go. She counted the seconds the way her father had taught her to count thunderstorms. One after another, quiet and deliberate, each number a small act of defiance against panic. The other 11 soldiers in the hold were counting too, she could tell, because none of them were talking. Just the scream of atmosphere and the pop of ablative shielding burning off in the deep, subterranean groan of a hull that had taken too much from the Vekhara rail strike on the way in. The ship leveled. Someone behind her exhaled. 300 kilograms of Ukrainian armor lineage pressed into a body that looked like it had been designed by committee, patted her shoulder once. "Still here," he said, as if that settled anything. The landing struts hit the surface of Narova Station's tertiary platform, and the whole craft bounced like a stone skipping water, before settling hard. The ramp cracked open. Cold recycled air poured in, tasting of copper and the particular machine oil smell that all Alliance stations shared, regardless of which moon they orbited, or which corporate charter had originally built them. Reyes was the first one out. Narova Station was dying, and it was doing it in the kind of way that looked organized from a distance. Clean corridors, functional lighting, the soft electronic tones of the station's schedule management system, still announcing shift changes. But the people moving through those corridors walked the way people walked when they'd already been told bad news and hadn't worked out what to do with it yet. Shoulders in, eyes tracking the floor, the particular stillness that sat over crowds when there was nothing left to say. She found Commander Osi of the station garrison in the tactical center, standing at a display table with his arms crossed, and his expression wearing the careful blankness of a man who has run out of options and is not yet ready to admit it. 5 ships, he said without looking up. Vekhara Armada. They've been sitting at the station's Lagrange point for 31 hours. No communication, no demands. Just sitting. Reyes looked at the display. 5 signatures, each the size of a frigate's drive signature, arrayed in a precise wedge formation. The Vekhara didn't position like that for negotiation. They positioned like that to be seen. "When's the last time they communicated?" she said. "Initial contact. 31 hours ago. They sent a single compressed packet." Osi finally looked up. It translated as a declaration of inheritance. "Station and all attached infrastructure belongs to the Armada now. They're not asking us to leave. They're informing us that we already have." The 12 soldiers she'd brought had filed in around her. She heard Volkov very quietly say something in Ukrainian, under his breath, that she didn't need to translate. "Where's the nearest Alliance relief force?" she said. 47 hours out, assuming they turn now, which they haven't been ordered to do. Because Alliance Command is still deciding whether Narova is worth a fleet engagement. And the station's population? 4,300 civilians. 312 garrison, my garrison. He paused. "We have 2 defensive batteries that still have targeting locks. The Vekhara know it. They haven't moved because they don't have to. The moment one of those batteries fires, they answer with all 5 ships simultaneously, and this station ceases to be." Reyes stood with her hands clasped behind her back and looked at the display for a long time. "Show me the ship we came in on," she said. He looked at her. "Your dropship? It's barely. Show me." One of Osi's technicians pulled up the registry. The vessel read as what it was. An aged Alliance fast Courier with military-grade shielding from a contract upgrade 2 years ago, payload bay that had been half converted to troop transport, and 2 forward-facing rail drivers that were rated for asteroid clearing, not fleet engagement. They showed off 5 mighty battleships, Volkov said very quietly to no one in particular, and saw 1 human warship arrive. "It's not a warship," the technician said. "Then they won't be ready for it," Reyes said. She turned away from the display and walked back toward the landing bay. And she didn't stop to see who followed her. She knew who would. Father had a house on the Basque coast, not far from the water, with a wood floor that creaked in 3 specific spots that she had memorized. Child so she could move through it at night without waking him. There was a kitchen with yellow tiles and an old radio that only received 2 stations, and on Sunday mornings, he made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and they sat at the table with the windows open, and the sound of the water coming in, and she thought about nothing at all. She thought about that kitchen now, because she needed something to hold on to that wasn't burning. The dropship's diagnostic panel told her what she already suspected. The ablative shielding was at 18%. The rail drivers were functional, which was the polite word for untested against anything larger than a drifting rock. The drive was sound, but the maneuvering thrusters on the starboard side were running 20% below spec, and had been since before she boarded, and she had made the decision not to flag it because there was no time to flag it. Volkov was beside her, going through the same numbers on his own panel. "How fast can she turn?" he said. "Slower than I want." "How fast can she fire?" "Faster than they'll expect." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the reinforced viewport, Narova's surface spread in curves of metal and polymer. The station's running lights blinking their patient rhythm. Beyond the station's edge, space. And somewhere in that space, 5 Vakhara warships sitting in their wedge formation, not even bothering to power weapons. "Waiting. You have a plan," Volkov said. "It wasn't a question. I have the beginning of one. The beginning. The beginning is usually enough." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and reached behind him and produced, somewhere in the architecture of his combat suit, a small flask. He held it out to her. She took it. Cheap grain alcohol, warm from his body heat, with the faint taste of something herbal that she associated with his home and nowhere else. Took one sip and handed it back. "If this goes wrong," she said. "If it goes wrong," he said, "there will be nobody to hear about it. So it doesn't matter." She looked at the numbers again. 18% shielding, 2 rail drivers, 1 undersized ship, 4,300 people who had no idea someone was quietly deciding whether they got to keep living. "Get the rest of them," she said. "I want everyone suited up in 15 minutes. We're not going to have a second chance at the approach." The Vakhara were not what humans had expected when they came. The first intelligence reports, compiled by teams who had survived partial contact, and not all of them entirely, described creatures who communicated through a combination of subsonic vibration and color shift across the surface of a membrane structure that ran along their dorsal spines. They were large by any standard, 7 feet prone, capable of moving on multiple limbs at a speed that human biomechanics found difficult to track. They lived longer than humans. They organized themselves in layered hierarchies built on what their analysts translated as something between lineage and territory, though those human concepts bent the meaning. A fleet commander of the Vakhara was a being who had been in continuous command for, by human reckoning, between 4 and 6 decades, which meant the commander of the 5-ship armada, sitting at Narova's Lagrange point, had been in command longer than Alba Reyes had been alive. His name, when transliterated, was Veth Kora Amun. His crews called him something in subsonic that translated approximately as the stillness before impact. He was sitting in the command chamber of his flagship when the sensor report arrived, and his membrane spine cycled through a particular amber hue that his subordinates had learned to treat with caution. One of the human vessels was moving. Not the station's defense batteries. Not a launch from the military docking pylons. The small courier that had arrived. The thing his analysts had flagged as functionally negligible, a transport vessel with token armament, was turning on its thrusters and orienting for an exit vector. He watched it on the display for 11 seconds. Strategic adjunct Velsora shifted color toward inquiry. "The courier prepares to retreat?" "No," Veth Koraman said. The word in the Vakhara tongue was a single low vibration. "Retreating vessels orient away from threat. That vessel is orienting toward us." The amber deepened. "1 courier," Velsora said. 5 warships." "Yes," said the fleet commander. "They cannot achieve anything. Their armament is." "I am aware of their armament." He was aware of their armament because he had been in continuous command for 53 years, and in 53 years, he had learned the thing that most of his commanders never bothered to, that what a vessel was rated for, and what a vessel would do in the hands of a desperate crew were not the same number. Human desperate was different. He had noted this. He had noted this in the second engagement at Proxima Reach, where 3 human vessels with collapsed shields had continued to maneuver for 17 minutes after any comparable Vakhara force would have recognized the encounter as concluded. He had noted it at Meridian Station, a single human pilot in a reconnaissance craft with no weapons had rammed his vessel broadside into a Vakara supply line long enough to allow colony evacuation. He had noted it, most of all, in the small things. The fact that the human courier's crew had not disembarked at Narova's civilian terminus and scattered, the way his analysts had predicted. Instead, they were still aboard, moving toward him. "Standby weapons," he said. "Fleet Commander, the courier presents no standby weapons. Target their shielding, not their hull. I want to see what they do." Reyes ran the math 5 times and it always came out the same. There was no version of this where she destroyed 5 Vakara warships with a fast courier and 2 asteroid-clearing railguns. That was not the math she was running. The math she was running was simpler. How much time did she need, and could she buy it? 47 hours until Alliance relief. The Vakara, by every doctrine they had ever demonstrated, did not engage targets that had already conceded. They displayed. They announced. They gave the opportunity for the kind of surrender that preserved their concept of the interaction as a completed inheritance rather than a military action, which meant the 31 hours of stillness made sense. They were waiting for the humans to finish processing that they had already lost. The moment Narova did anything aggressive, the display became a war, and 5 warships didn't leave survivors when they went to war. Courier approaching the formation wasn't Narova being aggressive. It was one human vessel making a decision that Narova's garrison hadn't made, a decision that was, technically, unaffiliated with the station. What Reyes needed was for the Vakara to talk. Not because talking would save them. She had no illusions about that. But the Vakara communicated through vibration and color shift, and they communicated with a ritual deliberateness that their doctrine enforced on command-level engagements. A fleet commander who received an approach from a signals vessel, especially a vessel of questionable armament, especially one moving with the steady, unhurried vector of something that didn't believe it was going to be shot, was required, by doctrine, formally acknowledge the approach before responding. Formal acknowledgement took, by Alliance intelligence estimates, between 2 and 4 hours. 2 to 4 hours in which 5 warships were procedurally required to hold fire. That was the beginning of the plan. "Volkov," she said, "are you still counting?" 1 to 47, he said from the co-pilot seat. "Still counting." The formation was visible on display now. 5 pale drive signatures in their wedge, patient and massive and absolutely certain. "Take us in at half approach speed," she said. "I want them to see us thinking about it." The crew of the courier ship had been issued for a routine transfer run. Volkov, technician Essie Park, who had a way with communications arrays that her service record described as unconventional but effective. 2 infantry soldiers named Haro and Fenris, who had volunteered for reasons neither felt the need to explain, and a pilot named Okonkwo, who had been flying supply runs on contested routes for 6 years, and had the particular focused calm of someone who had already done his panicking and come out the other side. Reyes briefed them in the hold, while Okonkwo held their approach vector. "They're going to challenge us," she said. "Standard Vakara doctrine, command-level approach. The challenge will come from the flagship. It'll be in the dual register, subsonic and visual both. And Park, I need you to log every frequency and every color shift pattern from the moment the channel." Park, cross-legged on a cargo pallet with her equipment open around her, didn't look up. "Already have the receivers calibrated. I can give you a rough translation in about 8 seconds of signal. It won't be pretty. It doesn't need to be pretty. It needs to tell me what they're asking and whether they're waiting for an answer." "And when they ask their question," Volkov said. "I answer it," Reyes said. "You don't speak Vakara?" "No, but I speak the part of every language that sounds like, 'I see you, and I'm not afraid.'" Part translates. Volkov passed the flask again. This time Haro took it, then Fenris. Then Park reached over without looking and took a sip, handed it back, and returned to her calibrations. Outside, the 5 warships grew larger on the forward display. The challenge came 40 minutes into the approach. It came as sound first. A deep, rolling vibration that resonated in the hull of the courier, felt as much as heard, traveling through the floor and the walls and the bones of Reyes's legs. Then the communications array lit with a visual component, the flagship's external arrays, cycling through a sequence of amber and deep violet. That Meant something she couldn't read, but that felt her bones, like the way a storm front looked when you saw it from shore. Park was already working. "It's a formal greeting challenge," she said. "There's a designation code in there. They're identifying as the first armada of the Vethkora line. Then there's a query sequence. Rough translation," she paused, frowning at her panel, something like, "Identify the purpose of your approach and the authority under which you act." Standard doctrine challenge. "They want to know who sent you. Tell them nobody sent me," Reyes said. "I sent myself." Park looked up for the first time. "That's going to take me a minute to encode without it sounding like I'm insulting their command structure." "Take your minute." While Park worked, Reyes stood at the forward viewport and looked at the flagship. It was an enormous thing. 300 meters of Vethkora engineering, plated in the dark composite they used for outer hull structure. Its running lights the particular cold blue that their culture associated with authority and permanence. The 4 escort vessels sat in their positions like very patient teeth. It was a beautiful formation, she understood. Looking at it, why it worked. Why 4,300 people on Narova Station had looked at that display and felt the story was already over. 5 ships arranged in a formation like that were telling a story in a language older than language. And the story was, "This is inevitable. You have already lost. This is only the accounting." The thing was, she'd heard that story before. She'd heard it from someone, sitting across a table at midnight, in a voice very quiet and very patient, explaining all the reasons why things weren't going to work. Here is the formation of evidence. 5 reasons in a wedge, an inevitability. She had walked out of that room and driven 200 kilometers to the coast, and sat on a rock above the water and counted waves until she could breathe again. And then she had gone back. Not because the math had changed, but because she had decided the math wasn't the point. Some things you move toward anyway. "Ready," said Park. "Send it." Vethkora Amun received the response and was still for a very long time. Translations links that his linguistic processor rendered was not quite what he had expected. Most vessels, human or otherwise, that faced a formal challenge from an Armada fleet commander in full doctrine formation offered one of 3 responses: identification and capitulation, silence, or a weapons discharge. The last was the act of a culture that had not yet understood what it was facing. This response was none of those. The human signal said, in the tortured approximation that translation always produced, "I am the senior officer of a vessel that arrived here independently and not under station command. I speak for myself only. I am not here to surrender and I am not here to fight. I'm here because 4,300 people on that station don't know whether tomorrow is available to them, and I wanted to talk to whoever made that decision." His membrane spine ran through colors he hadn't cycled in years. "They want to talk," Velsora said, with the subsonic inflection of someone who found this amusing. "Yes, 1 vessel, 2 rail drivers rated for debris clearance, shielding below 20% of standard. I know what they have. Then what purpose does the talk serve? They cannot change the outcome." Vethkora Amun turned slowly from the display and regarded his adjunct, and the color on his membrane spine settled into the particular deep amber that his crews associated with the thing he said very rarely, which was, "Pay attention." "The human female on that vessel," he said, "has done something that I have not seen in 53 years of command. She has approached a full armada formation in an unarmed transport on her own authority, not under orders, and she is asked to speak, not to negotiate, not to arrange terms. She is asked to speak to me." He paused. "She already knows the outcome. She is not here to change it. She is here for another reason, and that reason interests me." He turned back to the display. "Open a direct channel," he said, "and do not tell the rest of the fleet. This is between her and me." The channel that opened was audio and visual both. The Vethkora's visual, ponent, alien and color-washed, and impossible to misread as human. And Reyes looked at the fleet commander's image for a moment and said nothing. He was large. The display only showed his upper portion, the way their physiology worked. Showing anything more would require a viewport 3 times the width of hers. But the membrane spine was visible above his shoulder line, and it was cycling slowly through amber and a deep blue she didn't have a translation for. His eyes, which were not eyes in the exact human sense but served the same function, were fixed on her. She had prepared something to say. She had spent the 40-minute approach thinking about it. The precise framing, the doctrine-aligned language, the arguments that might register as worth hearing within a Vekara command structure that valued lineage and permanence and the correct reading of territorial inheritance. She looked at him and threw all of it away. "I know you're not going to move," she said. "I know that. 47 hours from now, Alliance relief arrives and the calculation changes. Before that, you're going to have to do something with us and the station. I'm not here to talk you out of your claim. Don't have the authority to do that. And I don't have the weapons to back it up. I'm here because I needed to know if there was anyone on the other end of this worth talking to." Park made a sound from behind her. Reyes ignored it. "My name is Alba Reyes. I'm 32 years old. I've been in Alliance uniform for 11 years, and in those 11 years I have watched your people. And my people circle each other and calculate and maneuver, and every time I look at the board, I see the same thing. Everyone is waiting for the other side to make the first mistake. Everyone is sure the math is on their side. Everyone is very certain." She paused. "I want to know if you know what it costs, not the ships, not the stations, the particular cost, to whatever it is you have that corresponds to what I have, of looking at someone across a gap, and knowing that the next thing either of you does is probably the one that ends it." She stopped. The fleet commander was still. His membrane spine had stopped cycling. It was, as far as she could tell, the first time she'd seen it stop. There is a particular moment, known to every commander who has held command long enough, that arrives without warning and is recognizable only in retrospect. The moment when the encounter stops being a doctrine problem and becomes something else. Something that doctrine wasn't designed for. Vethkora Amun had felt it twice before. Once at Proxima Reach, when a human vessel had refused to disengage past the point where disengagement was still possible. Once at the memory he returned to more often than any other. At a negotiation that had been going correctly, the precise formal manner that negotiations were supposed to go. Until the human across the table had leaned forward and said, in a voice with a crack in it, "We have children here," and the crack in the voice had been the thing, not the words. The crack that had communicated something no formal doctrine exchange had ever transmitted. The human woman on the display in front of him had that crack, not in her voice, in the question. She wanted to know if he knew what it cost. He had been in command for 53 years. He had ordered 17 fleet engagements. He had watched, through various viewport configurations, the end of things that would not begin again. And he had carried, in the particular organ that served the Vekara, as both memory center and something close to what the humans called conscience. Every one of those ends. He did know what it cost. The amber of his membrane spine deepened to something old and slow, and not entirely military. "You came here alone," he said. His translator rendered it in human audio frequencies. "To my armada, one vessel." Why? She looked directly at his image on her display, which meant, given how these channels worked, that she was looking directly at him. And she said, "Because in 47 hours, this stops being a conversation and starts being a war. And I wanted there to be a conversation first. I wanted us to have been people to each other first, even once. Even if it doesn't change anything." Silence in the command chamber of the flagship. Team. The kind of silence that happened when everyone present understood that something was occurring that would need to be recorded carefully. "Even if it doesn't change anything," the fleet commander repeated, in his language, slowly, in the register that his people used for things that deserved weight. Even then, she said. She had expected him to talk for an hour, maybe 2. He talked for 6. He talked about the Vethkora lineage claim to the Nerova sector, which was, as she had expected, genuine, not fabricated, not strategic theater. The Vekara did not generally fabricate territorial claims, because their doctrinal relationship with territory was too fundamental for that kind of maneuver. They believed in their claim the way rock believed in being solid. But he also talked about the second engagement at Proxima Reach, and then he stopped and was quiet for a long time, and she waited. She had learned to wait. She had learned it the hard way, in years that had taught her that the things people most needed to say were often the last things they got to. She had learned it sitting with her father the bad weeks. and the better weeks and the eventual good weeks, waiting in each silence for the next thing he had to say, which was always worth hearing and always came, if she didn't rush it. Volkov, behind her, was not entirely still. She heard him shift. She heard the quiet clink of the flask being set against the wall. She heard very faintly, Conquo humming under his breath. Something with no particular melody, just rhythm. Humming of a person who has found a way to be calm in the middle of things that weren't calm. The fleet commander heard it. "What is that sound?" he said. "One of my crew. It's what we do when we're waiting. It's a human thing. It doesn't mean anything in particular." A pause. Then the fleet commander, in his register for formal inquiry, said, "You're in your docking hold. The object your sergeant is holding had the sensor array up." She pulled a quiet image to Reyes's secondary display. Volkov, cross-legged near the bulkhead, turning the flask over in his hands the way he always did when he was thinking. "It's flask," she said. "We pass it around. It's a ritual. It means," she thought about how to say it. "It means we're together in something, not strategy. It's just, we're here, we're in this, here's the flask." The fleet commander's membrane spine did something she hadn't seen it do yet. Brief cascade of something pale and quick, and not quite amber. Not a command color. Something smaller and more personal. "We have a corresponding practice," he said. The translator struggled with it. Translated, the sharing of impact, before an engagement. It means the same. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Then we're not so different," she said. "You said that to provoke a particular response," said, with the inflection she had come to read as dry. "Did it work?" It was not untrue, he said. Which was, she had learned over 6 hours, close as he got to admitting anything. At hour 7, Veth Cora Foon said, "I will not withdraw the Armada. She had expected this, I know. The claim is legitimate, the doctrine is clear, I know. What I will do," he said and paused, and his membrane spine cycled through something she didn't have a name for yet, "is hold the current formation without escalation for a period of 60 hours, rather than the standard 40. This will allow the Alliance relief force to arrive before doctrine requires action. At that point, the engagement becomes a mutual recognition rather than an inheritance. Both sides may then conduct the appropriate formal review under Clause 3, the Meridian Accord, which both our peoples have signed." She sat very still. Clause 3 of the Meridian Accord was a territorial dispute review process that could take anywhere from 6 months to 4 years. It required both sides to stand down offensive positioning during review. No one died during review. "You were planning to do that anyway," she said. "I was considering it," he said. "I have been considering it for 36 hours. What you have done, Commander Reyes, is make the consideration conclude." She thought about that for a moment. "What decided it?" she said. "Not a question. The crack," he said, in his language. The translator rendered it as something approximate. The sound of a thing that is carrying weight. "In your question, whether I knew the cost," he paused. "I knew the cost before you were born. I did not expect to be asked if I knew it." Vakara formation held. The 60-hour clock began. In the tactical center of Narova Station, Commander Osi watched the display and did not for a full 30 seconds say anything. Then he said, "What happened?" "We talked," Reyes said. "You," he stopped. "One courier, 2 rail drivers. You went out there with 1 courier and 2 rail drivers and you." "We talked," she said again. "That's all." Volkov was behind her, and she could feel him not laughing with the particular effort of a man who had decided very firmly not to laugh, until they were somewhere more appropriate. And Essie Park was already writing up her frequency logs, with the focused energy of someone who understood that she had just compiled the most complete Vakara command register dataset in Alliance Intelligence Archives, and intended to publish it immediately. Okonkwo was probably still humming. "The Alliance Relief Force," Reyes said. "They need to be told what's waiting for them. This isn't a military situation anymore. It's a diplomatic one. Whoever they send needs to know about the Accord Clause, and about Veth Cora Amun, specifically. He'll want to speak to someone with appropriate authority, which in our terms means Senior Diplomatic Corps," Osi said. He was writing. "I'm already on it." She nodded and turned and walked toward the far side of the tactical center, where there was a viewport facing outward, away from the Vekra formation, toward open space. She stood there for a moment and looked at nothing. Volkov appeared beside her. He didn't say anything, she said. My father is going to ask me what I did this weekend. What will you tell him? She thought about it. That I picked a fight with someone bigger than me and talked my way out of it. That is the truest version, he said. He'll want to know if I was scared. Were you? She considered the question with seriousness it deserved. I was scared before I started moving, she said. Once I started moving, it was different. Once you're in the thing, there isn't room for scared. There's only the next thing and the thing after that. He was quiet for a moment. The next time, he said, maybe a larger ship. Maybe. Better shielding. Absolutely better shielding. He held out the flask. She took it, drank, handed it back, and stood with her hands in her pockets looking at the stars. 39 hours later, the Alliance relief force arrived. It was 6 vessels. 2 frigates, a carrier and 3 escort craft. And its commanding officer was a vice admiral named Sorensen who had been briefed, en route, and who came off his docking ramp, with the expression of someone who had prepared for a naval engagement, and was being handed a folder of paperwork instead. He found Reyes in the station canteen, drinking coffee that tasted more like the idea of coffee than the thing itself, staring at the table. You're the one who went out there, he said. Yes, sir. He sat down across from her. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had been through enough to stop making particular expressions about anything. He looked at her for a moment. Fleet Commander asked for you, he said. By name. He requests that you be part of the formal accord review. Said you were the appropriate human counterpart. She looked up. He gave a specific term for it, Sorensen said. Translator spent 2 hours on it. Best rendering they could get was. He looked at a handwritten note. The one who asked about the cost. She sat with that for a moment. I'll need a proper uniform, she said. Mine is not currently in great shape. I'll have one issued. He paused. You want to tell me how one officer in a beat-up courier got a Vekhara fleet commander to stand down a full armada formation? She thought about it. Thought about the flask, and the humming and the crack in the question. Thought about the kitchen with the yellow tiles. Thought about sitting on a rock above the water counting waves until she could breathe. I moved toward them instead of away, she said, and then I was honest. That's about the whole of it. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. The nod of a man who had expected something complex and was trying to decide if this was actually simpler than it looked or if the simplicity was the complex thing. That's about the whole of it, he repeated. Yes, sir. The formal review under Clause 3 of the Meridian Accord took 11 months. Reyes was present for most of it. She got better at the color shift register. Not fluent, not even close. Functional enough that the translator only had to correct her twice in any given session, rather than continuously. She learned that Veth Kora Amun had been given his command name, Stillness Before Impact, not for tactical reasons but because of a specific incident. Early on, in his career when he had held a formation still in the face of an attack, that every doctrine calculation said should have prompted retreat, and the stillness had been what made the difference. He had been still because he was thinking, not because he was brave. His commanders had interpreted it as nerve. He had never corrected them. She told him about her father's kitchen and the 2-station radio. He described, in the register that required 3 translators working in relay to render into anything approximate, the Vekhara concept of a place that is carried inside, a location so thoroughly known that it exists as a permanent internal reference point, a thing you can orient by when the external landscape stops making sense. She recognized it immediately. They settled the Narova claim in favor of a shared administrative zone under Meridian Accord oversight, not what either side had wanted. As the Vice Admiral had said privately, a solution that both sides could work with was a better solution than the right answer obtained by destroying everything. O.C. sent her a bottle of something extremely fine and a note that said only, "Thank you." Essie Park's frequency paper was accepted by 3 separate intelligence journals and changed the Alliance's communication doctrine. She received a commendation she mentioned only once, shrugging, and went back to work. Volkov was assigned to the Joint Security Detail that watched over the shared administrative zone during the review period. She heard that he had, on multiple shared his flask now with his Vekhara counterparts. She heard also that the Vakara security officers had reciprocated, and that whatever they had brought was either extraordinary or catastrophic, and that Volkov had reported it as both. Okonkwo was still humming. She didn't hear his particular hum again until the last day of the review, when the final administrative documents were being certified, and the room was full of diplomats and translators, and the controlled, busy tension of things concluding correctly. She heard it from across the room, no words, no melody, just rhythm. Just the sound of a person who had found a way to be calm. And she stood in the middle of the room and felt very quietly, as if the math had always been there, and she had just needed to see it differently. 47 hours she had needed. She had made 60, not by winning, by arriving. Her father was in the kitchen when she came home, at the table with the windows open, the old radio murmuring its 2 stations in the corner. He looked older than she remembered, the way people always did when you'd been away too long. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, and a book face down, and the expression he wore when he'd been thinking about something for a while. He looked at her, standing in the door, and said, "You look tired." "I am tired. Come sit." She sat. He got up and poured a second cup without being asked. Coffee strong enough to strip paint. And set it in front of her and sat back down, and neither of them said anything for a while. The water sound came through the open window, not large waves. Just the constant small work of water moving over stone, which had always seemed to her like the most patient sound in the world. "You were somewhere dangerous," he said. It wasn't a question. "For a while, not anymore." He nodded. He turned his cup in his hands, slowly, the way he did. Was it worth it? She thought about Vethkora Amun in his command chamber, membrane spine amber and cycling, saying, "Came here alone." She thought about 4,300 people who had gone to bed, not knowing whether morning was available to them, woken to find it was. She thought about the crack, her word, his concept, meeting somewhere in between. "Yes," she said. He nodded again. He took a sip of coffee. She took a sip of hers, and it was exactly as terrible as it always was, and she was deeply glad. The radio played its 2 stations. The water kept working at the stone. "Tell me," he said. So she did, she had thought, in the weeks before she came home, about how to explain any of it. The tactical details were easy. Those could go in a report, filed with the appropriate departments, reviewed by the appropriate people, stamped with the appropriate classifications. The operational decisions were easy too, in retrospect. Approach at half speed, invoke the doctrine acknowledgement window, open channel, talk. On paper it looked like a procedure. On paper most things did. What was harder to explain was the quality of the stillness in that courier's cockpit during the 6 hours she spent on channel with Vethkora Amun, with Volkov's flask somewhere behind her, and Okonkwo's humming filling the gaps between sentences and Park at her station. Logging everything with the focused attention of someone who had understood from the first minute that this would matter. The way the 5 warships had looked on the display, patient and cold and enormous, and the way they had begun, over those 6 hours, to look like something else. Not smaller, not less dangerous, just also something that had its own interior, its own cost-carrying organ. She thought about the loop of it. How 4,300 people had spent 31 hours in a shrinking window. Each shift change announced by the station schedule system, each hour a little shorter than the last. The available time compressing toward a point nobody wanted to name. And how the answer in the end had been to compress time differently. Not to escape the loop, but to step out of it by moving toward the thing that was contracting it. There was probably a lesson in there. She wasn't sure it was the kind that translated to doctrine. On the last night of the review period, she had been alone in the conference chamber, after the translators and diplomats had filed out, going over the final territorial boundary maps, and Vethkora Amun had remained at the far end of the table, which was very long, because they had needed a table that accommodated Vekara physiology, without anyone having to address the adjustment directly. And he had said, in the register she had come to recognize as his informal mode, "You have a place that is carried inside." "My father's kitchen," she said. "Yes. Tell when you spoke of it. It has the specific weight." He was quiet for a moment. "My place is a platform above a shallow sea, on my home world. When I was young, I stood there before my first command and watched the water. It was not the ocean, it was very small. The kind of sea that a young officer might overlook. His membrane spine cycled through something slow and amber and private. I have stood on every significant platform of command in this sector. I have not found another place with that weight. The small ones have it, she said. I don't know why. Because we were honest there, he said, before we learned the other performances. She had thought of that for a long time afterward. The idea that the place, that is carried inside, was the place where honesty had lived before. Everything complicated it. When the yellow tiles caught in the terrible coffee and the two-station radio, where she had come home from things she didn't know how to explain and sat down and been told, "Come sit, tell me." The Vakara had a word for that. The humans had a kitchen. Both were the same thing. The review concluded. The boundary maps were certified. The administrative zone was formally designated. 6 Alliance officials and 8 Vakara representatives signed the documents in the specific sequence that Vakara inheritance doctrine required, and when the last signature was applied, the room observed the mutual silence that both cultures, independently and without prior arrangement, observed at the conclusion of significant proceedings. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then someone, she always believed it was Volkov, though he denied it, started humming. And across the table very slowly in the deep subsonic register that served the Vakara as their equivalent of quiet moment after the moment. The Vakara did something that no Alliance translator had previously logged, because it had never happened in a formal diplomatic context before. They hummed back. It wasn't the same frequency. It wasn't the same rhythm. It was unmistakably a response. A resonance, the sound of one kind of waiting recognizing another. Essie Park had her equipment running. She always had her equipment running. The paper she published 6 months later described it as a previously undocumented Vakara social vocalization, informal, non-doctrinal, catalogued under the rough translation of the sharing of the settled moment. It was cited extensively, changed several things. But what Reyes remembered, standing in that room with the maps certified and the humming spreading and Veth Kora Amons, membrane spine cycling through the pale quick cascade that she had eventually learned to read as the closest thing his physiology did to a smile. What? She remembered was that it hadn't felt like a diplomatic achievement. It had felt like a kitchen, like windows open and water sound and someone asking, without requiring anything particular in the answer, "Tell me." So she had. So they all had. That was as far as she could determine, the whole of it. In the months after she came home, she was reassigned twice. The first reassignment was to a posting she had not expected. Diplomatic Liaison, Vakara Affairs, Alliance Strategic Command. The letter used words like unprecedented and initiative and cross-cultural. She read it twice and then set it down and made coffee. Not her father's coffee, not yet. She was still at the base in Porto, and stood at her window looking at a courtyard that had a very small fountain in it, that birds used, and she thought, so, this is what happens when you go toward the thing. The second reassignment came 4 months into the first, when a junior analyst in her new department compiled a comprehensive survey of every recorded human Vakara interaction over the previous 18 years and identified a pattern that several senior strategists had missed. In every instance where the interaction had escalated to conflict, one or both sides had been operating from a fixed position of calculated certainty. In every instance where escalation had been avoided, there had been a moment of unscripted contact. Someone saying something that was not in the briefing, asking something that doctrine hadn't prepared for. The analyst presented this to a room full of people who had been conducting diplomacy for decades, and several of them were quiet for a long time afterward. The analyst's name was Maren Holt. She was 24 years old and had never been in a fleet engagement and had, as far as anyone knew, never shared a flask with anyone in a cockpit. But she had spent 18 months reading transcripts, and she had found the pattern that the people inside the pattern couldn't see because the pattern only became visible from outside. In retrospect, when you could lay all the shrinking loops side by side and see what they had in common. Reyes read the report and then walked down 2 floors of the Alliance Strategic Command building and knocked on the door of a very junior analyst shared office and said, "I'd like to talk to you about something you found." Holt looked up with the expression of someone who expected to be corrected. "You were right," Reyes said. "I have a specific example I think you'll want in your data set." She sat down. She told her about the courier, about the flask and the humming and the 6 hours on channel and the crack in the question, about the fleet commander who had known the cost for 53 years and had not been asked. Holt wrote everything down with the focused attention of someone who understood that this would matter. Afterward, when she was leaving, Reyes paused at the door. "One thing," she said. "In your next version of the report, the unscripted contacts, the moments that changed things. What's the common element? The one thing they all have?" Holt didn't have to check her notes. "Someone moved toward the thing they were afraid of," she said, instead of calculating from a distance, every time. Reyes nodded. "Keep writing," she said. Her father asked, the second time she came home, whether she thought it would hold. The settlement, the zone, the 11 months of careful construction. She was at the table with the coffee, and the windows open and the water sound, and she turned her cup in her hands, for a moment before she answered. "For a while," she said. "Longer than if we hadn't done it. That's not forever, no, but forever isn't usually on offer." She paused. "What's usually on offer is longer than before, better than the alternative. Enough time for something else to become possible." She looked out the window. "That's actually a lot. That's more than most situations come with." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his own cup. "The alien," he said. "The one you talked to. Veth Cora Amun. He knew the cost. You said that he'd known it for 50 years. 53. And knowing it didn't stop him." She thought about that. About the amber membrane spine and the formal doctrine and the 53 years of command. Each engagement logged in whatever organ the Vekhara carried their reckoning in. Knowing and still proceeding. Not because he didn't care, but because the knowing and the proceeding were not in the same register. "It didn't stop him," she said, "but it was there in him the whole time." She looked at her father. "I think for some people, some beings, the cost just accumulates. They carry it. They don't let it change the calculation because if they did, they couldn't do the work, but it's there. And if someone asks about it..." She stopped. "If someone asks, and they've been carrying it long enough, and they're tired enough, and the question lands right, they answer," her father said. "They answer," she said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee. Outside a gull went over, and the water worked at the stone. "You asked the right question," he said. "I asked the only question I had." He smiled, which was not something he did often, and which was therefore worth more than most things. "That's usually the same question," he said. She sat with that for a while. The radio murmured in the corner. The water kept its patience. The coffee was terrible, and she was glad. She thought about 4,300 people who had woken up to find the morning was still there. She thought about a being who had carried 53 years of cost and had, just once, been asked about it. She thought about a courier with 18% shielding and 2 asteroid-clearing railguns, moving at half approach speed toward 5 warships that had already written the ending, and the particular quality of attention in a cockpit when everyone aboard has decided that the math is not the point. She thought about a loop that had been contracting, every iteration shorter than the last, the available window shrinking toward nothing, and how the answer had not been to stop the loop but to step out of it, to move, to go toward the thing. She thought about how the screen had looked, in the film that had played in the back of her mind ever since she was small, as the borders closed in and the frames became a slit and there was almost no room left for anything, and then, the woman in the story had stopped, trying to fix the mechanism, and had just said the true thing to the right person, and the mechanism had fixed itself. She had never been sure, watching it, whether that was realistic. She was more sure now. "Tell me," her father said again. He always said it at the end, when there was more she hadn't gotten to. The water worked at the stone. "It was worth it," she said. And then, "Here's what I haven't told you yet." And the morning held.